Back during summer breaks when I was a kid, I was pretty much glued to my mom during the daytime. Everywhere she went, I went too, as I guess she just didn't trust me to stay home alone. I can't blame her. I was definitely a little menace when my age was still in single digits. But actually, maybe she should have left me home alone because taking me everywhere with her resulted in the single scariest moment of my childhood. So, one day, we head out on a grocery run real early in the morning, and since I was still half asleep, I pretty much refused to get out of the car. Since she was only planning on being a couple of minutes at the most, she agreed, then scurried off into the store as I closed my eyes and decided to take a nap. Oh, an important point, I climbed into the back seat to do this, then cuddled up under the blanket that my mom kept back there. Keep this in mind for what comes next. The next thing I know, I hear the car door opening again, so I open my eyes thinking, wow, that was fast. And that's when I see that the person who just sat down in the driver's seat is not my mom. It's some dude with a shaven head, and I still remember all the scabs on the back of his head as he started doing something under the dash, something which I now know was hot wiring or whatever you want to call it. I remember being so scared that all I could do was watch, thinking, I don't know you. What in God's name are you doing in my mom's car? I didn't expect him to start it because even though I was incredibly young, I knew that he had to have those special keys to make the car move. But then out of nowhere, the engine starts, after which the guy shuts the door, starts driving my mom's car out of the parking lot. Only then did I start to scream because it hit me that I might never actually see my mom again. This random guy wasn't just stealing my mom's car, he was stealing me too. The moment the screams left my mouth, the guy slammed on the brakes so hard that it almost threw me off the back seats. He spins around, and I'll never forget how this guy had actual facial tattoos. These are scary enough to see on another adult, but since I was only like a kid at the time, I just figured this dude was a straight up demon. He looks at me and then just screams, "Get out of the car, kid!" I didn't even have to be told twice. Even though I was still in my PJs, I practically jumped out of the car, still bawling, and just ran towards the grocery store as the car drove off. I can only imagine how horrible it must have been for my mom to have her kid come sprinting into the store in floods of tears, screaming, "Mom, Mom, someone just tried to take me away," then having to piece together all the info to realize that she almost lost her only son. These days, I totally take blame for the whole thing. I shouldn't have been such a lazy little brat, and the whole thing would just be a non-event to me. It'd be the day our car vanished, not the day I almost accidentally got kidnapped. I always tell my mom not to feel guilty about it, as basically all is well that ends well, right? But still, the whole thing definitely tops the list of my most frightening childhood memories. I didn't have a great childhood. I'm not one to complain about it. My parents did the best they could, but we ended up living in some pretty terrible places with not so nice families. Then right around the time I started secondary school, the kids I was hanging out with at the time started smoking cigarettes. Yeah, they were like 11 or 12 and they were smoking. Not just taking performative puffs on sticks either, I mean full-on smoking like troopers. And being the divvy that I am, I joined them on more than one occasion, and they basically taught me to smoke out by this old World War II pillbox. Then one time, we all go out to the pillbox and this kid gives us all a ciggy from the pack he'd stolen from his mom. I thought he was being a bit generous, but I wasn't one to complain. I just didn't think I could finish off a whole cigarette on my own, since just a few drags on one had me feeling pretty woozy the previous few times. But I figured, a few tokes, I can peg it out. Smoke the rest of it later. The next thing that had me kind of suspicious was how weirdly loose the cigarette seemed, almost like it had been tampered with somehow. Now, I know, huge alarm bells are going off in the head of every right-minded person listening, but honestly, at like 11 years old, I couldn't even imagine what it might have been tampered with. I was really naive. I didn't know what hash or Mary were. I didn't know about anything other than ciggies and beers. So I'm looking at this ciggy, and then I look up at the lad who gave it to me, and I remember asking, have you done anything to this ciggy? He says no. I say okay, then light up and start puffing. Immediately I start coughing, but my friend reassures me that it's just the last one in the pack. I'll never forget that. He said it like it was totally normal to have one loose, scrabby ciggy in the pack, like it was tradition or something. So I tried a few more puffs, but started coughing again. So I gave up on trying to smoke it, tossed it away, then asked for some of my friends. I know something was definitely going on when he seemed annoyed that I'd thrown away my ciggy, and just when I was trying to work out what he might have done to it, I started feeling very, very funny indeed. Everything started to tingle. My eyes felt all puffy and my vision started to Ferris wheel, with each eye going in the opposite direction. I tried to talk, but words just wouldn't come out, and my tongue felt like it was swelling up in my mouth, and suddenly I just got so thirsty I could barely think about anything else. Then no matter how many deep breaths I took, I just couldn't seem to get enough air, and suddenly I found myself lying in the grass. Like I literally couldn't walk. I had no idea what was going on, and when I started begging my friends to help me, they looked terrified and just ran away like I was dying or something. I can't stress this enough. I really did think I was about to die, even when my dad rushed onto the scene to take me back home. My so-called friends had been decent enough to run and get them, but all they said is, "Pete's feeling sick," and Pete fell down. Just a vague idea of what was actually going on. So, my dad's scared and I'm so terrified I'm just in tears when he picks me up, goes to run off, and stops. I remember how he sniffed my clothes and hair all studiously for a moment, and I almost started to get aggressive with him because I remember I was so frustrated that we stopped moving. It was a weird experience because I felt like I was in some strange euphoric dream state, and I really felt like if we stopped, I was going to get very angry. It was such a weird experience. And it was at that moment that he rushed me to the hospital. And it was the subsequent time that I spent in the ER that my parents found out and later revealed to me that the kid had actually dipped the cigarette in some sort of formaldehyde embalming fluid and essentially given me some form of PCP, which for those that don't know, in some instances can make someone act with schizophrenic-like side effects. My parents said the doctor said I was really lucky that I didn't continue to smoke, as it may have had even more serious side effects, even though, as time went on, I still felt very on edge in my time at the hospital and after the time I got out. My dad told me it freaked my mom out so much that all she wanted to know was how a kid my age had gotten his hands on that stuff, and I was forced to tell them about my friend, in which case the police visited his house, forcing his hand to reveal that he'd seen his younger uncle that lived with him using that stuff prior. I don't know what became of that kid and his family, as I'm not sure if my parents had continued to press charges or how everything with them actually transpired, but the whole thing had just been apparently one horrible prank in the kid's mind. And although I'm not entirely sure if it was out of malice or some spirit of experimentation, that little prank amounted to one of the scariest memories of my entire childhood. I grew up in the super middle class area of my hometown, all townhouses and nice restaurants, but it bordered some really rough neighborhoods. All thanks to the school zoning, a lot of my high school friends lived in the nearby projects, so I'd go over there to hang out after school and on weekends. We had our little group of friends, but we were familiar and friendly with a few of the other crews that were into some considerably naughtier things than us. For example, there was this guy, Mike, and although we didn't hang out much, we always stopped to say hi to him and his boys if we ever saw them in the streets. But like I said, we rarely hung out with them because, for fun, they liked to steal cars. It might sound crazy when I say it wasn't malicious, but it's kinda true. Mike and his crew would steal a car, burn rubber for a while, then park it right back where they had found it before the owner even knew it was gone. I remember one time hearing about how they felt so guilty about stealing one lady's car that they parked it up where they found it, but not before they topped off the gas tank to replace what they burned. They were crazy like that, but they weren't bad guys, and besides, we were just dumb teenagers at the time, so we thought that it was just cool to do. Anyways, it's summer break after our freshman year of high school, and me and my boys are just wandering around, acting like fools, but otherwise keeping out of trouble. I remember one of us had managed to use the fluff of his top lip to trick some old gas station attendant into selling him a pack of Marlboro, so we were headed down to this piece of scrubland we knew about to smoke up. About 5 minutes away, we started smelling smoke from somewhere, but like black smoke. So we're all like, uh-oh, whose apartment is on fire? But we keep walking, seeing nowhere on fire, so we just get more and more curious as to where the fire's coming from. Then, we see two of Mike's boys just tearing it across some yards, sprinting as fast as their little legs could carry them. We shout over to them, and although they look over, they don't stop. They don't look happy to see us like they usually would. They just keep running. So immediately we're like, oh God, what hood rat stuff have they been up to? And it wasn't long before we put two and two together and figured out that the fire might well be something they did. Then right as we get to the desolate plot of land we've been planning on going to, we see it. Just this ball of flames under a brick wall. Then when we get closer, we realize the fireball is actually a burning car. We were pretty shocked. I'd never heard of them doing anything like that before. It was always illegal but relatively harmless fun. Why set a car on fire when they could have just returned it like they normally did? You think they crashed it? I remember someone asking, but no one could be sure. We just waited and watched as the fire department showed up to put out the fire, closely followed by the cops. I remember we thought about running, but how it was pointless. It'd just make us look guilty. Eventually, when the fire was out, the cops walked over and we just front as best we can, tell them we don't know anything about the car or those that set it on fire. I think the cop knew we were lying. I suppose you just get good at picking up on them when you hear so many, because he just acted like we were withholding information, telling us that we'd be in a lot of trouble if we were protecting the guilty party. And we just shrug it off. It wasn't like it was the first time we lied to the cops. It wasn't even the first time we'd lied for Mike and his crew. But then out of nowhere, the other cop comes over to see how it's going, and his partner's like, these kids know something all right. They're just tight-lipped. Then when the other guy responded, our response told them all they needed to know. Don't want to snitch, huh? The other cop said. Well, as long as they can sleep at night, because whoever's kid is burnt to a crisp in that thing isn't going to be sleeping for quite a while. I remember the sinking feeling I felt in that moment, how the color must have drained from my face because I could feel it leave my face. One of Mike's boys had been in that car when it caught fire. The other two just ran when they found that they couldn't pull him out. Then get this. We came to find out that the kid who burned to death in the car was Mike himself. He'd been the driver, and the front end of the car had basically pancaked when he'd apparently deliberately crashed it into a wall. What he did that for, I don't know. Maybe he was high or something, but either way, his legs got trapped. The car caught fire, and he burned to death. I guess his boys were just so scared and shook up that they just ran. And Jesus, thinking about it later, I realized that if he was conscious when they were trying to free him, and he started burning before he passed out from the smoke, those guys would have heard him screaming as he burned. It was a whole thing, man, all up in the news for weeks after. Mike's boys turned themselves in after a while, and I think they were so messed up that they just couldn't live with themselves. Ended up getting suspended sentences when they spilled their guts about how Mike was driving and how he was acting crazy. I don't know how true that is. I mean, it sounds true, but I don't know. I guess I'm just trying to say how Mike didn't deserve to die like that. And if I had to label one memory from my childhood as being the worst or most traumatic, it was watching that car burn, not knowing one of our friends was burning in it. When I was around 8 years old, I was playing hide and seek with a few friends. We grew up in quite a small town in Croatia, one in a very rural area, So lots of trees, but also lots of construction because of a new road that was close by in the 90s. So on this day, the place we were playing hide and seek at was a half-built structure on the edge of the forest. I ran outside looking for a place to hide that wouldn't be expected, but that was still on the grounds of the construction site as per the rules. I thought I was being so smart, but it was one of the dumbest things I've ever done because I walked right into a very deep hole that I had no idea was there. Even worse, the thing was full of brambles, so not only was I stuck, but any kind of movement, even calling out for help, had tiny little needles stabbing me all over. I was also finding it difficult to stand up because I'd broken my ankle, but I was so full of pain and adrenaline at the time that I wouldn't realize this until later. I'm calling out for help over and over again, and eventually my friends, coming running to me, see me stuck down there in the hole. They turned pale when they saw me down there, and it was then that I realized how much I was bleeding from all the little cuts and scratches. I must have looked like a little Jesus with a crown of thorns, blood all over my face and arms, and no wonder they were horrified. Anyway, they ran off to find some people to help, as this was way before cell phones or smartphones, so they actually had to go find these two guys who just so happened to be driving by, flag them down, then hope that they had some kind of rope or cable so I could climb out of the hole. Unfortunately, they didn't, but they must have gotten across how urgent it was, probably by telling them how badly I was bleeding because the two guys came running, having decided to use one of their long coats as something for me to grab onto. It actually worked, but the one guy had to actually grab the other by the legs to lower his torso down into the hole, and I mean, it was really that deep. I'm still in a lot of pain, but I summoned the will to just suffer through, stand up, grab onto the coat, and that's when I realized something was seriously wrong with my ankle, but I could still use my one good leg to scramble up as my arms clung to the jacket. I was cut to pieces, bitten by ants, and still had thorns stuck under my skin, but I was just so happy to be out of that hole. One of my earliest and most painful childhood memories is the day I got the news my granddad had died. I must have been about 5 or 6 at the time, and I'll never forget my dad turning up at school to take me home early. I was absolutely made up. I grabbed my coat and bag, waved goodbye to my friends, and practically skipped out of the classroom like I just won the lottery or something. But I couldn't have been more wrong to be happy about the early departure, because when we got home, I walked into the kitchen to find my mom in tears. I couldn't believe it. I was devastated. When she told me that Granddad was in heaven, I asked if I could go and see him. I remember she broke down trying to explain how that was just not possible. Cut to about 4 or 5 years later, I've just started secondary school and I'm over at a cousin's house playing footy in the back garden. As we're kicking the ball back and forth, the subject of the conversation somehow gets how my granddad died, and I realize in that moment that I didn't actually know how he died. I assume my cousin didn't know either because why would he? But apparently he did know, and that's how I found out that he'd taken his own life. I didn't find out why for another 10 years or so, and the details aren't that important to be honest. Just know that this little newsflash gave me a soul-crushing mixture of freaked out, terrified, and depressed. Me finding out caused a bit of behind-the-scenes drama between my mom and aunt, but it resulted in us taking a visit to a place called the Hilbre Islands. Lying at the mouth of the Dee estuary, the Hilbre Islands are an archipelago of 3 islands consisting of Hilbre itself and 2 smaller islands called Middle Eye and Little Eye. My granddad's ashes were scattered on Hilbre, as it was a favorite fishing spot for him and my great-uncle Ralph. Apparently they used to spend weekends at a time up there when they were kids, and apart from a few summer homes and a lighthouse, the place is basically uninhabited for 9 months out of 12. Looking back at it, it must have seemed like they were kings of that place. And a big part of that is the fact that Hilbre is one of just 43 unbridged tidal islands that can be reached on foot from the mainland of Great Britain. This means it's only accessible on foot when the tide is out, and the tide only goes out once a day for a couple of hours. missed the window, and you're well and truly stuck for just shy of 24 hours, which later presented us with somewhat of a problem. So on the day of visiting Hilbury, I was just happy to be spending time with the cousins. Sure, the occasion was a bit of a heavy one, but family still has that insulating property when you're young, doesn't it? It was the middle of the summer, unseasonably warm even for the UK, so for a while there, I didn't have a care in the world. We trotted along the wet sand, running back and forth, splashing in little puddles. It was great. But that all changed once we actually got to the island and my Uncle Ralph, Granddad's brother, started to wander off on his own. My mom and aunties all huddled together to watch him, all going quiet and urging us kids to do the same. The whole expedition then took on the distinct atmosphere of a funeral procession, all silent and reverential, which gave a gut-punch reminder of why we were actually there. Then my great-uncle shouted something at the islands. "I know you're here, Freddy." In hindsight, what happened that day is this weird mix of wholesome and heartbreaking. My Uncle Ralph had to be in his 60s by this point, but going back to that island made him feel like a kid again, and made him feel close to the brother he'd lost, so much so that he evidently felt like he could sense his presence. As an adult, yeah, heartbreaking, but as a kid, it scared the life out of me. Uncle Ralph was like the supreme authority. If he felt my granddad's presence on Hilbury, then his spirit must have been hanging around. I remember grabbing my mom's hand and quietly asking her, "Is Granddad Fred really here?" She was struggling to hold back tears by that point. I hadn't been to the funeral since I was so small when he died, and I suppose all that was just catching up to her as she shook her head and told me no. But the thing is, there was something about the way she said it, something that made me think that she was lying to protect me or something. You have to understand, I was only 12, but I was smart enough to realize that I had been shielded from something bad, and I mistook her no for that same informational shield. So as far as I was concerned, my granddad Fred's ghost was actually haunting Hilbury Island. I was scared, really scared in fact, but I didn't think we were in any danger. I mean, he was my granddad, he loved us, and that meant his ghost wouldn't hurt us, right? Besides, I was with the family. If anything happened, they'd protect me. So, the trip to Hilbury came and went much like that. Very tense and emotional, but otherwise uneventful. Uneventful until we tried to get back across the land bridge before the tide came back. I remember my aunties starting to say things like, "We need to start getting back soon. The tide is due to be back in an hour." And since there was no messing about when it came to that sort of thing, we got a wiggle on and got walking back across the sand. We had at least 50 minutes to spare. This is according to my auntie anyway, so there was absolutely no reason why we should have been worried about the tide coming in. We should have been back on dry land for 15 to 20 minutes before any water started sweeping in, but instead, something very different happened. As you can imagine, the walk back across the sand was considerably less jovial than the initial crossing. Gone was the playful, carefree attitude of jumping in puddles, and instead, we all walked by our respective mums, still firmly in the grip of the funeral atmosphere that had descended. Uncle Ralph walked ahead of the group with everyone having agreed to just leave him be for a while, and I was roughly in the middle with my mom. Then I remember just looking out to sea and watching as this little baby wave came washing over the sand at us. There wasn't any kind of outright panic, and there never was, I suppose, but everyone understood what was going on. The tide was coming back in, way earlier than we'd expected, and it was coming fast. It definitely caught us by surprise, but like I said, there was no real panic because we were never in any real danger. I know that takes a bit of steam out of my scary story, but to be honest, that's not what had me so freaked out afterwards. I know this might sound crazy. I was 12, so give me a break, but I got it into my head that somehow it was my granddad's spirit making the water come back in, because he wanted to drown us so we'd join him in the afterlife or something. Yes, I know in hindsight it sounds hysterical, and it is hysterical. But all the mystery and the grim legend surrounding my granddad's death coupled with how my Uncle Ralph seemed convinced he was there somehow. It was really, really freaking me out. By the time we were back on dry land, I was practically hyperventilating, but I couldn't tell anyone what was wrong because I knew it had upset my Uncle Ralph, which then just made me even worse because there was no one to reassure me that I was just being daft. I realize now what was really happening is that I was having nothing more than a panic attack, all because I was young, superstitious, and scared. There was never any threat, never any actual danger to us. The whole thing was in my head. But that's just the thing about being a kid, isn't it? There's an intensity to certain fears that just don't survive into adulthood, not in the same way. And sometimes the silliest things, or more specifically our misunderstanding of them, can terrify us to an extent that the event is burned into our memories forever. So my dad is from Scranton, the world's least attractive place name, but my mom is from Cape Town in South Africa, which is honestly one of the most beautiful places I've ever visited. Trust me when I say that as a biracial millennial, the country's messed up history is always in the back of my mind, and there are still shocking levels of poverty and injustice which obviously need to be dealt with. But I love going over to visit my mom's side of the family and seeing a strong black middle class emerging from a country that literally used to be the most racist place on earth. I don't know, it gives me hope. But anyway, the first time I visited, I was 11 back in December of 2012. And although it ended up being an incredible trip that I have a bunch of cherished memories from, one particular incident ended up being the scariest of my entire childhood. So one of the things that had me and my little brother so excited was the prospect of going on safari. We were both obsessed with Disney movies at the time, particularly The Lion King, so you can imagine how thrilled we were at the prospect of seeing real-life Simbas, Timons, and Pumbas. But the reality of safaris is that if you don't bring a pair of binoculars, you're guaranteed to see almost nothing. I'm deadly serious about that too. Like the first time that blew my mind was when our Jeep's guide pointed over to some trees and was like, "Look, there's 3 giraffes feeding from those trees over there." When I looked, I literally saw nothing but a bunch of trees, and I was so confused for a few moments until one of the trees moved its neck. They were almost perfectly camouflaged, hiding in plain sight almost, and that's when I realized that the savannah is less like a kingdom and more like a battlefield. The remainder of the afternoon went fantastically, and although our parents' digital camera was almost always on full zoom, we managed to get a few half-decent pictures of the wildlife. I remember being a tiny bit disappointed because, in my naivety, I figured it'd be more like a petting zoo than a live-action version of Where's Waldo. But right as we're coming to the end of the safari, we rounded a corner and, boom, there's a whole herd of elephants right next to us. I actually gasped. I think half the Jeep did, and it was without a doubt the single most majestic thing I've ever had the pleasure of seeing. Awe-inspiring, in the very sense of the word. But then suddenly, everything went horribly wrong. So the Jeep we were in was the last one in a convoy of 3, and when we came across the elephants, all 3 Jeeps slowed to a crawl so we could all get photographs. Then, as we're about to move on, one of the elephants steps out of their little formation and starts to slowly follow us down the track. All the tourists were like, "Oh my God, look, he wants to join in with the safari." And I have to admit, I thought it was so wholesome making an elephant buddy like that. But this particular bull elephant was showing us both his ears at the same time. And if anyone reading knows anything about elephants, they know that this is basically a challenge. Bull elephants challenge each other from time to time, and generally speaking, one of them will back down before it comes to a clash of tusks. But if neither of them back down, one of them inevitably charges. So while us tourists are fawning over our new friend, the guides in the Jeeps were getting very, very nervous. And the way my mom tells it, as much as they were trying to hide their anxiety, the way they were talking to each other on the radios was a dead giveaway. As the Jeep started to speed up, so did the bull elephant, and after a few minutes, it became quite obvious that this thing not only wasn't happy with us, but it actually wanted to fight. Then, when it let out this rip-roaring elephant trumpet that seemed to scream out, "Come at me, bruh," everyone realized this guy's intentions were not good. And this is where the trauma comes in, because almost the whole time my mom had been singing this old British song, I think it's British anyway, that goes like, "Nellie the elephant packed her trunk and said goodbye to the circus. Off she went with a trumpety trump, 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 trump." She was singing it to my little brother, who was still only about 5 or 6 at the time and definitely wasn't appreciating the safari as much as the rest of us. So to keep him chill, Mom kept quietly singing to him, talking to him, anything to keep him from throwing a complete tantrum. Then, as the situation is getting more and more tense and the people in the jeeps are getting more and more scared, my mom starts singing this song again to keep Ty, my little brother, quiet. This meant that one of the scariest moments of my life, where I thought I might actually be crushed to death by a charging elephant, was soundtracked by this uber-dumb British nursery rhyme. Obviously, we all got out of there okay. The jeeps ended up doing like a synchronized speed up and get out of there kind of thing, and with a sudden rev of the engine, we left that elephant in the dust. But before we escaped, there was this moment where as we got faster, so did the elephant, and it was as incredible as it was terrifying to see the raw power that thing could generate. Like we were getting faster and faster, but for a few seconds, the elephant didn't get any further away, like it was just matching our speed almost effortlessly until we finally picked up the speed to finally get away. As you can imagine, everyone in the Jeep was pretty shaken up by such a close and tense encounter, and I can certainly speak for my little brother who was almost totally freaking out even when we got to a safe distance. No matter how much my mom sang that dumb old song, Ty just kept sobbing and wailing like he was just a conduit for all the fear everyone was feeling. The whole thing amounted to one isolated scary moment in a trip that was otherwise pretty life-changing. It didn't ruin anything, no one got hurt, and when we tell it these days, it's like 60% funny story, 40% scary, but I still remember that feeling of terror I felt, even all these years later when I watched what had once been a big, cuddly cartoon become a real-life monster. The summer before I started middle school, me and my buddies were hanging out around the monkey bars in the park when some guy comes up and says he's a gymnastic coach. He offers to teach us how to hang off the bars, then do like backwards flips so that we landed on our feet. He helped my buddy do it first, and since it looked kind of cool, the remaining 2 of us decided to give it a try. Then, while he was helping us do the flip, I remember the guy grabbing my butt real hard in the process of helping me land, and he did it in a way that, even at such a young age, I was like, that seemed unnecessary. And here's where I give the obligatory speech about trusting adults, not realizing that he'd crossed the line, yada yada yada. But the point being, although I got a weird feeling about the guy, I couldn't exactly go complaining about every adult I disliked, or I'd be constantly complaining about 90% of my teachers. So anyway, the guy tells us we have a lot of raw potential, and that if we wanted to get some more practice in, or maybe even become part of his gymnastics team, we could meet him across the town the next day in some gym he owned. We respond, sure, maybe we'll think about it. And the guy promises to come back and see us sometime. I wasn't looking forward to the prospect, but I didn't look forward to much of anything back then. Anyway, a few hours later, I'm back at home having dinner with my parents when one of them asks how my day was. I start telling him about this and that and how I'd been hanging out in the park, and that's when I start telling them about our little run-in with the gymnastics coach. In the process of telling them what happened, including the grabbing and the invitation to his gym, I noticed that my mom and dad started to get this increasingly horrified look on their faces. Then, by the end of the story, my dad has the cordless phone in his hand and he's calling someone, and my mom is writing down my physical description of the guy, insisting I tell her every last detail of what the guy looked like. Dad called the cops, then called my buddy's parents, and although at the time I didn't quite understand what the big deal was, in hindsight, I think we got really, really lucky. After that, we ended up all getting these big talks about stranger danger, which obviously we found pretty horrifying. But the real tragedy was that we weren't allowed to hang out at that park anymore, not without adult supervision anyways. And that sucked because they didn't let us do tricks and stuff on the monkey bars. Only as an adult with kids of my own do I understand the raw terror that our parents felt, and as much as it sucked that we had to have a chaperone to the park for a few years after, the alternative would be considerably worse. I think I was maybe 7 years old when this happened, but it's definitely the scariest thing that ever happened to me during my childhood. I remember it was a Saturday morning during the summertime, and my mom took me and my brothers out to get breakfast with our grandparents. After we'd eaten, we decided to all go over to their place, and I asked my grandpa if I can ride with them. Of course they say yes, so I hop into their car, wind down one of the rear windows, then rest my head in the opening like a dog or something, like with my head on the one side. Grandpa tells me not to stick my head out too far, and of course, I'm careful not to. But then the whole journey was awesome because I've got the wind rushing through my hair. I feel like I'm flying, generally just having a great time. Then, when we get to my grandparents' house, Grandpa shuts off the engine, then starts closing the back window with my neck still in it. This was one of the automatic windows too, meaning when you stop the car and push the button one time, the whole window came up so you didn't have to sit there at your destination with your finger leaning on the button for like 5 whole seconds. It's supposed to be a feature of convenience, but it ended up almost murdering me. I let out this horrified scream, and Grandpa just rushed back to the car to stop the window from closing. I'd never, ever seen him move that fast before. He legitimately was terrified that he was going to kill me, which only made me more terrified in turn. Obviously, everything turned out okay, but good God, if it wasn't a seriously close call, and my grandparents were always overly careful about stuff like that in the future. It was a pain in the butt sometimes, but whenever I got tired of all the precaution, all it took was one little reminder of that incident with the car window, and I suddenly remembered how it was always, always better to be safe than sorry. I think I was maybe like 6 years old, and although I loved swimming, I wasn't particularly good at it, and mostly stuck to the shallows while the bigger kids played in the deep end. I remember watching them, getting kind of jealous, watching them diving to the bottom of the pool and back, and thinking that was incredibly impressive. So, in an attempt to impress all the older, cooler kids, I start paddling into the deep end to make an introduction. I then remember stopping, then reaching down to touch the bottom of the pool. I don't know what I was thinking, but I immediately go under and end up swallowing some water on the way back up, which then has me coughing and spluttering. It was embarrassing enough with the older kids laughing at me, but then when I realized I just couldn't stay afloat, I really started to get scared. I remember bobbing above the water and waving at my sister, trying to get her attention to be like, help. But all she did was wave back. Not maliciously, of course. I think she just figured I was being an idiot, but in that moment I figured, oh God, I'm not getting any help. And although I was only 6 or whatever, I can remember that feeling of horror like it was yesterday. Luckily, the pool's lifeguard had his eye on me the moment I started to venture into the deep end, and was Johnny on the spot when he saw me starting to struggle. He throws in one of those floaty thingies at me before diving in himself and helping me back into the shallow end. I'm pretty sure I cried like a baby, and I was really cautious of the deep end until I properly learned how to swim. Even today, the ocean kind of terrifies me, and I know it's probably all just deeply rooted in that whole almost drowning in like 9 feet of water thing. But it's weird how fear like that sticks with you well into adulthood. One morning, back when I was 7 years old, I was waiting for the school bus on this real clear summer's day. Even that young, I remember it being pretty picturesque, and as if it couldn't get any more wholesome, some mom and her baby appear about 50 yards away. Mom is cycling while her baby is strapped in one of those bike seats behind her. It was obviously a nice enough morning that mom figured that she could run whatever errand she had on her bike, and both looked like they were enjoying themselves immensely as they rode past. Then, all of a sudden, I think mom tried to cycle in between the curb and a speed bump, and she goes flying right over the thing's handlebars. Obviously, the baby is strapped into the seat, but must have taken a nasty bump on the way down because then it let out this ear-splitting scream. I couldn't have imagined a more horrifying sound than that, and then the next second, the mom toppled it. She was so full of fear and worry that she actually ceased to sound human for a second as she howled, "My baby." It was primal, the kind of fear only a mother can feel for her child. I'm pretty sure people rushed to call the cops or whatever because the adults around us just burst into action to try and save the day. The school bus turned up before any first responders did, but it showed up maybe a minute or two after the fall, so hopefully the lady and her baby weren't waiting too long. To this day, I have no idea what happened to that kid, if it was okay or not. I assume so, since I didn't hear anything from my parents or them talk about something in the paper, and I don't even know if it was a boy or a girl. But good God, do I remember their screams, even all these years later. Okay, so I was a weird kid, and I mean like weird. I was the kid who was scared of his own shadow, terrified of germs, scared of dogs. I was just generally a nervous wreck. Then one day, one of my friends tells me some urban legend about alligators in the sewers that could swim up the drain pipe and eat you while you were taking a poop. Now, I was never attacked by an alligator, and I'm pretty sure the whole story is just made up, but try telling that to 8-year-old me who was subsequently terrified of toilets. And not like terrified of toilets so I'd just be nervous while taking a whiz or whatever. No, I'm talking terrified like I stopped going to the bathroom altogether. Holding my pee was tough, so I had to find places to go. School urinals, the bathtub at home, or just like behind a tree in the park or whatever. But holding my poop proved to be actually kind of easy at first, and I remember the first day or two passing with very little in the way of pain or discomfort. I think it was only towards the end of day 3 that I started getting these sharp, clenching pains in my gut. I honestly thought my poop was just being absorbed back into my system or something. It's poop. It's soft, not like rocks or whatever. I know. It was stupid thinking, but I think I was like 6 or 7 at the time, so go figure. Anyway, sharp clenching pains, they just got worse and worse, but still, I won't go. I know it sounds crazy, but in my head it was like suffer a little discomfort or be eaten ass first by a sewer croc. And when you put it that way, of course you don't poop, and of course you wait until you have literal medical emergency from not going to the bathroom. I'd have to call my mom to ask her what exactly it was I ruptured down there, but it was painful, and it required immediate medical attention. Lights and sirens like kind of medical attention. I still remember this one doctor examining me, prodding at my tummy, and getting this cry of pain and response out of me. He then looks me square in the eyes and says, "Young man, when was the last time you went to the bathroom?" When I told him like a week prior, the guy was like, "Oh my God." When he obviously realized the giant mystery mass inside of me was this giant ball of feces. Long story short, after that, they knocked me out and conducted 2 operations on me. One to stop the bleeding from the rupture in one of my intestines, or something again I'd have to look into, and the other to extract all the poop out of me because it really had basically just solidified up inside me. People kind of laughed about it these days, and I don't blame them. But at the time, I was just convinced that I was going to die. And I think maybe the worst part of that was the humiliation of knowing how people would find my death either horrible or hilarious. I have this really vivid memory from my childhood, one that I still think about from time to time all these years later. It was a hot summer's day. I'm walking around to my friend's house, and when I looked in the distance, I'd have sworn I could see like a pile of red popsicles lying in the road. Like you could see all the shiny red, then the little off-white sticks coming out of them. So in my little kid brain, I'm thinking, oh, jackpot, maybe some ice cream truck dropped them or something. But when I get closer, I realize what I'm looking at is actually a dead cat. I think that poor little dude must have been run over maybe 2 or 3 times by as many different cars. It was just mush. All apart from his little cat head, which had somehow been spared most of the damage. It was the look on his little face that screwed me up. He just looked in so much pain. I ran straight back to my parents' house and just erupted into tears. I'd never seen anything as messed up as that, and honestly, I don't think I have since. One of my earliest memories and most frightening childhood memories was the time my mom almost got kidnapped in Italy. Well, she wasn't really kidnapped, but it pretty much looked like she was, and all that'll become clear in due course. So we're walking through the streets of Naples in Italy. Me and my dad are walking ahead while my mom and older sister were walking behind us. Me and my dad stepped to the side of this really narrow street to let this younger lad on a moped pass, and as we watch him pass us and draw closer to my mom, all I see is her hitting the stone beneath her before she starts getting dragged away by the moped, which is revving at full speed away from us. My sister screamed, my dad jumped into action, and in my mind, I was watching the kidnapping of my own mother unfolding before my eyes. I can't remember screaming or crying or anything like that, but I was so young that I'm assuming I did. I just have this really vivid memory of my mom's body almost rippling as it was dragging along the cobblestones. Like I said, in reality, she wasn't being kidnapped. The thief on the moped had just grabbed her by the handbag and was attempting to steal it. But my mom, being the true child of Yorkshire that she was, she kept hold of this expensive handbag, determined not to lose it. And with it being so expensive and therefore so well made, the strap didn't break. And what should have been a quick snatch and run turned into something pretty bloody scary. But even the thief must have been scared too, because at some point, the way Mom tells it, he looked behind him, sees that he might actually drag a woman to her death over a handbag, and just lets go because he doesn't want the smoke. Mom had some horrible scrapes and bruises on her when it was all said and done, and she had bandages on her for the next 7 days of the holiday, but honestly, I was just so grateful that I still had my mom and that some Italian bandit hadn't stolen her away from us to be sold in the underground mother's market. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. If you got a story, be sure to submit them to my subreddit, r/letsreadofficial, and maybe even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about all the extra perks offered for the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories in big compilations and save huge on data, located anywhere you listen to podcasts. Links in the description below. Thanks so much, friends, and I'll see you again soon.